As Dr. Crowley mentioned in his lecture, we experience a new voice for the first time. We experience the turn of the century, and with the turn of the century, we experience different social standards, a different writing style, different writing focus. Communication is beginning to change. No longer does it take mail, weeks or excessive days to travel across the landscape. People are finding easier ways of transportation, so the ways that we communicate with one another change. And with the turn of the century comes World War I, one of the biggest moments in human history. And with that, when people coming home, it makes us ourselves a question. What does it mean to be human? And Wallace Stevens starts to express through a different style of poetry that society is starting to change. And we see that in his poetry. And of modern poetry, let me just read this first. The poem of the mind, in the acting of finding what will suffice, it has not always had to find. The scene was set, it repeated what was in the script. So what Wallace Stevens is talking about here is, before this, poetry was set in stone. This is the format you're supposed to follow, whether it be A-B, whether it to be generally just talking about love or high society or something like that. But now Wallace Stevens is beginning to talk about how it's starting to change and how we are starting to have to cater to a different audience because a different audience is paying attention and they no longer want to read something only about romance or high society. The poem continues on with this. Then the theater was changed, meaning poetry was changed, to something else. Its past was a souvenir. It has to be living to learn the speech of the place. Again, referencing how poetry is having to evolve if it wants to stay relevant. It continues, it has to face men of the time and meet the woman of the time. Again, referencing that it has to progress and evolve with people's interests and how people are living their lives. It has to think about war. Now, let's stop there. Before this, war wasn't... It was covered, but the romanticism of war was still there. And before World War I, there was a huge romanticism of war going on in Europe. And with that, people were pushing for World War I. But after World War I, they realized war's not so great. Surprise. So Wallace Stevens is starting to explore the idea that what people are reading and what people want to experience are no longer matching up with poetry's old standards. So if we continue to a highly toned old Christian woman, we experience something else that takes a shift in society. The first line, poetry is the supreme fiction. Now, what does that mean? Supreme fiction. Now, Dr. Crowley mentioned in a lecture when you're talking about Willa Catheder how people, it was looked down upon for people to read fiction. And if you had another book other than the Bible in your house, it was looked down upon. So the idea that Wallace Stevens comes out with the first line says, poetry is the supreme fiction. Well, what's he going on about? So if we continue looking at the poem and go down a few lines, unpurged by epitaph, indulged at last, is equally converted into palms. So what does this mean? Palms reference Palm Sunday, and when we go to church and whatnot, it is saying that we need to outwardly convey our expression to God in order to gain credibility. Why is that? Why does that matter? And he's making a jest throughout this whole entire poem by saying poetry is the supreme fiction, because obviously it's not, and he's making a joke of it, and I'm sure it riled people up at the time. But the poem challenges the idea that church is no longer becoming the top priority, and the idea of church is slightly being challenged. So if we were to go on to the Emperor of Ice Cream, as Dr. Crowley mentioned in his lecture, we experience the common folk, maybe for the first time, something that has not been talked a lot about in other writings of times, generally, of course. The first line, call the roller of big cigars. As Dr. Crowley mentioned in his lecture, this was a commoner's job. This was no big royal king or anything of such. Few more lines down. Bring flowers in last month's newspapers. As they were used to wear, and let the boys bring flowers in last month's newspapers. Again, talking about common people. The poem continues on to 4 lines up from the bottom. If her horny feet protrude, they come to show how cold she is and dumb. Let the lamp affix its beam. The only emperor is the Emperor of Ice Cream. What does this mean? What does this poem mean as a whole? The Emperor of Ice Cream. What did I just read? So, generally, prior to this, poetry was focused on romance or high society, the glorialization of wars, and what Wallace Stevens is adapting to, much like in modern poetry, is the changing of times. The changing of times that people no longer want to read about romance or other things, that he is having to change his focus, or poetry is needing to change its focus to focus on common problems about common things if it wants to continue on existing in this world. And largely that's what Wallace Stevens is talking about in his poetry, is about how do we take poetry and evolve things, much like coming home from the war and experiencing life. How do we move on, and how do we continue taking things forward? Because life had been so stagnant prior to this. Thank you for listening to my little video, and I appreciate it.